Welcome, everyone, to another panel reading group as part of our Global Equiano event. Today, this esteemed panel will be discussing Equiano and Black ecologies. First, we have Alex Moulton, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Science at Hunter College. Previously, he was a faculty member in the Department of Sociology and Department of Geography and Sustainability at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. His research is concerned with Black geographies and ecologies, socio-ecological justice, political ecology of memory, histories of plantation and marronage, questions of care, Black people's flourish and repair inform his research and writing. His work has been published in journals such as Caribbean Geography, Geography Compass, Sociology Compass, Environmental and Planning, Geohumanities, and Environmental Humanities. Present projects include Black Geographers on Film, a digital archives of Black geography, and an edited volume on the futurities of climate change. Joining Alex will be Katey Castellano, who is a professor of English at James Madison University. Her book, Robert Wedderburn, Abolition and the Commons, Romanticism's Black Geographies, is forthcoming later this month with Cambridge University Press. And her recent essays have been published in Small Acts and the European Romantic Review. Her and Alex are co-editing the Broadview edition of Robert Wedderburn's writing. Next up is Jennifer Leetch, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bonn's Excellence Cluster and the Bonn Center for, the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, where she's currently working on a project that connects Black life writing to 18th and 19th century ecologies. She has a PhD in English literature from the University of Würzburg and has recently held fellowships and guest lectureships at the University of Melbourne and, the University of Glasgow and Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. She is PI of the project titled Water as Method, Reading the Hydrocolony in Global Literature, and affiliated researcher on the DAAD-funded project Mobile Feminisms. Her first book on contemporary African diasporic women's writing appeared with Palgrave in 2021, and she has published on topics such as botany and the Black Atlantic, nuclear waste, dumping in East Africa, and oceanic and literal imaginaries from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And finally, we have Julian Whitney, who is an early career teacher, scholar, and specialist of British Romantic literature. Since 2020, Julian has taught at Wabash College, I'm not sure if I said that right, in Indiana, a residential liberal arts college for men. He teaches classes including composition, British literature from 1800 to 1900, manga and anime, law and literature, and writing for video games. His research scholarship focuses on the British Romantic poets with a particular emphasis on the Byron Shelley circle. In addition, he writes about 18th century Black Atlantic abolitionists such as Otoba Cugoano. His publications include an article on Lord Byron's poem Darkness, and that was with the Byron Journal, and an essay about Cugoano's abolitionism, and this was in studies of Romanticism. Welcome, everyone. And we'll start with Katey and Alex.
Black geographies as a field has its own intellectual geographies. One of the sort of geographies that I try to follow is one that goes back to the 1960s amidst the struggle for racial integration and the plight of the deepening plight of a Black urban community. Out of this emerged a kind of nascent Black geographies concerned with Black urban political life. Questions at this time about the role of the Black geographical imagination, the way that Black people might take up the concepts and tools of geography to address anti-Blackness, and what the questions of Black life meant for the conceptualization of space and human environmental relations were sort of animating discussions within geography. There have been more recent formulations of some of these questions and new questions about the sort of global architecture of anti-Blackness, the constraining effect of, canons, and the way that Black life sometimes is overdetermined by a political imagination that is fascinated or fixated with the plantation and the ghetto and spaces in between. So in grappling with these questions and what these kinds of questions say about geography and the social sciences, the condition of the human and the way that nature is produced and imagined, scholars have sort of given coherence to Black geographies and Black ecologies as a framework for considering Black spatial knowledge, agency, epistemology, and poetics. I think Black geographies and Black ecologies, therefore, are making a claim, or perhaps two claims, that Black geographical thought, agency, and poetics exist, and that there is analytical purchase in them that is beyond an additive function to sort of existing approaches and forms of thinking. So, as someone from the Caribbean, there's an appeal for me of Black geographies. And what I've been trying to do with my work is to sort of take up Black geographies as a way to think about the historical geographies of the Caribbean beyond the plantation, but certainly also concerned with the plantation. I was late to theory. I was late to coming to theory with a training in sort of concrete environmental geographies of disasters and so on. And so as I came to think about what theory could mean, work by folks like Sylvia Wynter was especially important or helpful, particularly the notion of the plot. And so my thoughts today are sort of informed by my sort of ongoing efforts to grapple with, contend with, and understand what Sylvia Wynter's work, and as taken up by Catherine McKittrick, offers for thinking about space and these kinds of global Black geographies. So there's a quote on one of the slides that I want to show just quickly. McKittrick points out that the geographies of slavery and post-slavery and Black dispossession provide opportunities to notice that the right to be human carries in it a history of racial encounters and innovative Black diaspora practices that, in fact, spatialize acts of survival. Sort of a similar sentiment from Wynter that I want to suggest here before the rest of my comments. Wynter suggests that the history has been taught is a history of the plantation, the official history of the superstructure, the only history which has been written. But the plot too has its own history. So I approach a plot as a usable historical geography and as having a usable geographical history, motivated by conversation with folks like Katey. I've wanted to invite people with me into a reading and writing practice that notices how, for individuals like Equiano or for Wedderburn, there are these concrete sites of racial encounter where the sort of racialized positions are given meaning, sometimes violent meaning. And these meanings are shored up by practices that are spatial in nature and that manifest in differentiated mobility and forced movements. These sites of encounter are, I'm arguing, not just a background for the sort of racial politics, but actually help to constitute race and are racialized, right? And so these sites become, because of their function, right, in these dynamics between race and space, become, I think, important for us if we are interested in geography, the environmental humanities, in a way that will offer us futures beyond what we are given by sort of plantation-centric futures. So in thinking about these sites and their geographies and what these geographies offer, what the secretive histories of the plot offer, I've been trying to sort of think through what might be an ethical mode of research in the environmental humanities that remarks upon Black life and space, but approach these spaces as a plot that do not necessarily serve as a thing to uncover, but as a condition to understand and to then think with for sort of the broader questions of futurity and the sort of way that we understand Black epistemologies. And so I articulated some of these ideas in my paper, Plotting a New Course for the Environmental Humanities. And these are sort of the three broadly speaking, sort of methodological and epistemological ideas that I take up from Winter and McKittrick that is guiding the way that Katey and I have been thinking and are approaching the Wedderburn, the Broadview edition of Wedderburn's writing.
So the call for papers for this conference asked what readings, theoretical approaches, and artistic responses are needed to fully grasp Equiano's narrative. And this question prompted our proposal. As a scholar of literature, I've found the field of Black geographies applicable in the way that Alex notes, as both material and as method. It provides historical context and a theory for reading 18th and 19th century Black life narratives. And my own turn towards Black geographies as a productive methodology arose during my research on Robert Wedderburn. Wedderburn was born in Jamaica in 1762 to an enslaved mother, Rosanna, and he was raised by his grandmother, Talkie Amy, who was a market woman and obeah practitioner in Kingston. As a young adult, he migrated to London, where he joined ultra-radical activists and became a leader of the Spencean philanthropists. Scholarship that includes Wedderburn in this early 19th century network of romantic British radicals interprets Wedderburn's political writing as neatly aligning with or even derivative of white agrarian radicals, such as his friend Thomas Spence. However, with my background in environmental humanities, I was noticing that Wedderburn's vision of land redistribution was distinctively Caribbean. And I needed scholarship in Black geographies to help me discern his land and food-based politics. Fortunately, I ran into Alex about this time and he gave me a reading list. So these are the kinds of things that I was struggling with Wedderburn. The quotation here, he is addressing enslaved people in Jamaica, and he argues, above all, mind and keep possession of the land you now possess as slaves, for without that, freedom is not worth possessing. So he was celebrating place-based freedom practices of enslaved people as a foundation for liberation, which is a representation that might at first appear to resonate with some of the representations pro-slavery writers had that sought to justify slavery as humane and claimed that enslaved people in the West Indies had better living conditions than English laborers. However, Wedderburn was advocating for something distinctive for Black-led abolition. And when he argued that freedom was found in continuing to keep hold of land as the basis for abolition, he was taking up a very different position than the anti-slavery position, for example, of someone like Wilberforce, who sought to transition the plantation to wage labor and leave its overall structures intact. And Alex's work here has been really helpful for me in thinking through this. He argues, and this is a quote, these communities and farming plots enabled the reconstitution of a commons and were sites of repair, spaces where African identities were reformed into New World Black identities. And my argument is that Wedderburn represents Black geographies in Jamaica as sites of repair. Like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, he argued freedom is a place. Gilmore argues that, quote, abolitionist critique concerns itself with the greatest and least detail of these arrangements of people and resources and land over time. And Wedderburn similarly argued that liberation from slavery required continued use of land and resources as communal property, which would be the grounded material basis for a liberated society. So when Wedderburn argued that justice included land-based reparations for slavery, he was outlining Black geographies as places, but also as stories that advocate for restoring land to dispossessed people. So that's the research that I've been doing along with Alex. But for this seminar, we wanted to extend this to discuss whether Black geographies might be generative for understanding parts of Equiano's narrative. So Lisa Lowe argues that Equiano's narrative has been canonized because it is, quote, a quintessential narrative of progress, unquote, and it reassures readers that, quote, the slavery of the past is overcome and replaced by modern freedom, unquote. But she also notes that there are some important digressions and disruptions to this overall narrative of progress. And I would like to speculate that Black geographies can help reveal some collective reparative Black ecologies that are punctuating this overall progressive narrative. And I have two brief examples. The first one is about the Kingston markets. Equiano wrote, when I came to Kingston, I was surprised to see the number of Africans who were assembled together on Sundays, particularly at a large commodious place called Spring Path. Here, each different nation of Africa meet and dance after the manner of their own country. They still retain most of their native customs. They bury their dead and put victuals, pipes, and tobacco and other things into the grave with the corpse, as in the same manner as in Africa. So this description of Kingston's internal markets refers to multiple Black geographies across Jamaica. The internal markets sold food and crafts that were created on the provision grounds. African Caribbean ecological knowledge created provision grounds and the abundance that led to these markets. The description also reveals how these food and land-based geographies facilitated the continued growth and dissemination of cultures of the African diaspora. And Hilary McD. Beckles explains that these markets were a, quote, rebellious commercial culture that was linked to a complex network of social relationships on the estates. So they're more than markets. They're not capitalist markets, internal markets. And they traded not only in provisions, but in talk of resistance and liberation. Moreover, Equiano's mention of funerals for enslaved people might gesture towards their history as potentially insurrectionist gatherings. So Equiano's description of Kingston resonates uncannily also with Wedderburn's more overtly rebellious description of his grandmother, Talkie Amy, who was a market higgler and obeah practitioner who performed burials around Kingston. So thus Equiano records Kingston markets as sites of repair, and that's Alex's phrase there, using the dispossessed, or allowing the dispossessed to repossess culture and community. And I have one more example here. A second instance of Black geographies can be found in Equiano's conversation with an enslaved man on Montserrat. The man explained that he loved fishing for subsistence in his minimal leisure time. However, when he caught fish, they were often taken away from him. And this is the quote. One day he said to me, very movingly, sometimes when a white man take away my fish, I go to my master, and he get me my right. But when my master by strength take away my fishes, what me must do? This artless tale moved me much, and I could not help feeling the just cause Moses had in redressing his brother against the Egyptian. So departing from a more tempered tone here, Equiano suddenly contemplates violent revolt in his allusion to Moses killing the Egyptian. And what spurs the brief urge for violent revolt here is not plantation slavery in itself, but the more extensive system of colonial white supremacy that assumes the right to exploit Black labor and environmental knowledge. And fishing and foraging on the margins of the plantation system were forms of what Alex has called plot work, drawing on Sylvia Wynter. And this is a quotation from Alex's article. The place epistemologies and relations of communities who are forging worlds, through plots against the apocalypse of slavery and dispossession. And Alex also already mentioned Catherine McKittrick's argument that, quote, the land and nourishment can sustain alternative worldviews and challenge practices of dehumanization. So perhaps Equiano's flash of insurrection here is because this man, against all odds, developed environmental practices that countered his own dehumanization and nourished community. And even this reparative work at this point was being brutally exploited. Scholars have argued that Equiano's referring to this man as a brother is a moment that marks a movement towards Equiano seeing himself as part of a larger collective issue with slavery. And I think it's significant that it's tied to the disruption of Black ecological knowledge, skills, and subsistence. So to conclude, through the lens of Black geographies, perhaps Equiano's ostensible narrative of progress to British liberal freedom is periodically and productively ruptured by plots of liberatory Black placemaking projects.
Okay, thank you, Alex and Katey. Jenny, do you want to jump in here?
Here I am. I'm also going to share my screen. I hope you can see it. Okay. First, I want to start off by expressing my thanks to the organizers of Global Equiano and also to my co-panelists. I'm really honored to share the space with you today and very excited that I can learn from you. The following reflections on reading Equiano ecologically arise from in-progress work on my current book project, which, as Desha mentioned, attends to 18th and 19th century Black life writing as it merges with different ecosystems and ecological communities across the globe. In the book, I aim to reconsider or reread the early canon of Anglophone, Caribbean, and Black Atlantic life writing in order to draw attention to the immense critical and creative potential of the environment for the formulation of Black selfhood. And here I'm, of course, thinking with and influenced by and inspired by the vital and the vibrant work that's been going on in Black geography and Black ecology. And I'm hoping to add a literary studies perspective to that. One of my chapters offers an oceanic reading of Equiano's interesting narrative, and it focuses on the vibrant Black eco-epistemologies that live alongside, beneath, and superimposed over the colonial archive that so relentlessly attempts to structure knowledges about slavery and Black life in the 18th and 19th century. Equiano's narrative, I think, constructs the Black self in conversation with an oceanic world that teems with lively interspecies relations and unexpected ecological solidarities, but also with ecological dependencies and the eco and genocidal realities of European settler colonialism and its violent and extractive logics. The ocean is Equiano's most constant companion. It's a place of death and of horror, and yet promises relative financial security and a kind of contingent freedom aboard its ships. The ocean's ecologies enrich and complicate Equiano's experiences, pushing the boundaries of his ecological understanding and in turn also the way he fashions himself within the early Atlantic world. From the Caribbean to the Arctic, Equiano's narrative reveals his complex ecological position within the empire's extractive practices. His presence on an imperial scientific expedition to the North Pole, his experiences on a plantation on Nicaragua's Mosquito Shore, or his plea for the end of the slave trade in exchange for Africa's natural resources on the closing pages of the narrative, divulge an expansive global ecological stance that oscillates between fantasies of mastery and control and visions of humanitarian ecological relation. As one particularly interesting and also challenging note of Equiano's ecological relations, and an instance rarely discussed in scholarship on Equiano in general, I want to focus on his journey to the Arctic as described in chapter 9. Because it's here that the tensions of Equiano's oceanic eco and also ego project appear most starkly. Ensnared in the colonial matrix while also offering alternative eco-logics that both collude with and subvert imperial narratives of the world that are founded on the conviction that the world belongs to some while not to others, and that it can be divided, conquered, and profited from. Chapter 9 is located in the latter half of Equiano's interesting narrative. At this point, he has fought in the 7-Year War as an enslaved sailor for the British. He's traversed the Americas and escaped death by sea and on land multiple times, and he has gained manumission. The trip to the Arctic is not only marked by failure for the British explorers attempting it, it's also occasion for Equiano's biggest crisis of identity, and it will act as a catalyst for the final stages of his religious conversion. And here is Equiano about the impending journey to the Arctic. Quote, "On my return to London, I waited on my old and good master, Dr. Irving, who made me an offer of his service again. I was very happy in living with this gentleman once more, during which time we were daily employed in reducing old Neptune's dominions by purifying the briny element and making it fresh. Thus I went on till May 1773, when I was roused by the sound of fame to seek new adventures and to find towards the North Pole what our Creator never intended we should, a passage to India." Charles Irving, a naval surgeon and inventor, gained recognition for creating a device that made seawater drinkable. This is what Equiano refers to here when he talks about purifying Neptune's dominions. While Equiano was in Irving's employ, Irving was called to accompany the Phipps expedition to the North Pole, a British Royal Navy enterprise proposed by the Royal Society, who posited the existence of an ice-free, open polar sea. With the aim to find a new trading route to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, 2 bomb vessels were retrofitted for improved ice resistance and embarked on the polar journey in the summer of 1773, commanded by Constantine John Phipps and Skeffington Lutwidge. The vessels ultimately became ensnared in the ice near Svalbard to the west of Greenland, and the crew had to return to England only 4 months after they had set out. Equiano's involvement in the expedition not only highlights the heterogeneous composition of the crew on this ultimately expansionist endeavor, his presence as a Black, formerly enslaved man also problematizes the straightforward narrative of colonial exploration, revealing the inherent complexities and contradictions of such imperial ventures. How can we contextualize Equiano's presence on this empirical and expansionist trip amidst an ecological crisis, which is also an ongoing crisis of slavery and settler colonialism? What kind of knowledges emerge when we examine his interesting narrative against the grain of the colonial archive, such as, for example, Constantine Phipps' official report? Can we read Equiano's ecological relations in the Arctic otherwise? The 2 ships that journeyed northwards, as Vincent Carretta notes, were floating laboratories, not only for testing various inventions and instruments, but also for taking official astronomical and marine measurements. Irving's apparatus fits right in. His experiments with distillation and purification of seawater were crucial for long voyages, where fresh water supply was a persistent challenge. The ability to produce drinkable water from seawater could significantly enhance the sustainability and safety of long expeditions making such technology vital for future naval and exploratory missions, ultimately providing the British Empire with another tool in its already considerable maritime toolbox of conquest. And here's Phipps's diary entry. Quote, "We began this day to make use of Dr. Irving's apparatus for distilling fresh water from the sea. Repeated trials gave us the most satisfactory proof of its utility. The water produced from it was perfectly free from salt and wholesome, being used for boiling the ship's provisions, which convenience would alone be a desirable object in all voyages, independent of the benefit of so useful a resource in case of distress of water." And Equiano himself is a bit briefer. He says, "On the 20th of June, we began to use Dr. Irving's apparatus for making salt water fresh. I used to attend the distillery. I frequently purified from 26 to 40 gallons a day." Both accounts here celebrate the efficiency of the apparatus and positively evaluate its usefulness for voyages such as this. Equiano's narrative, however, shows something that is not present in Phipps's report proper. It reveals Equiano's very intimate and physical relationship to this imperial technology. To personally attend, as he says, the distillery, which purified water by steaming it with the addition of certain chemicals to have the salt sink to the bottom of the cauldron, and to produce these 26 to 40 gallons, which is up to 150 liters a day, would have meant intense physical strain and exertion. How this apparatus exactly functioned or how this labor must have felt is not explicitly mentioned by Equiano, but if we look to the technicalities outlined in Phipps's appendix, which includes a directory from Irving, the brutal, if not life-threatening, realities of this method emerge. Water rises in vapor more copiously at 180 of Fahrenheit than the open air at 212, which may be considered as its boiling point. Frequently, the still head is blown off with incredible violence. Nothing is more required in the distillation but keeping the surface of the tube always wet, which is done by having some seawater at hand and a person to dip a mop or swab into this water, etc., etc. As the person responsible for these potentially highly dangerous activities, Equiano, in a way, takes part in the hydrocolonial project pushed by the British Empire, and yet his embodied experience with the boiling and steaming apparatus, mopping brine and distilling fresh water, also speaks to the way he is physically, intimately caught in the overheated engine room of this huge machinery at extreme risk to his life. There's more here, I think, about Equiano's expertise, and following McKittrick, also Black innovative technological knowledge as survival. But let me pause here and pivot slightly to think about another aspect that emerges in this chapter 9 in Equiano, and which might help us consider further what kinds of humanness or humanity circulate in the narrative and how they perhaps subvert white settler colonial logics. As a key moment of Equiano's Black Arctic and its more than human ecological potential, I want to turn to an animal that disrupts the surface of the Arctic world quite often, the walrus. And here's Equiano again, quote, "Some of our people once in the boat fired at and wounded a seahorse, which dived immediately and in a little time after brought up with it a number of others. They all joined in an attack upon the boat and were with difficulty prevented from staving or oversetting her. But a boat from the carcass having come to assist ours and joined it, they dispersed, after having wrested an oar from one of the men. Though we wounded several of these animals, we never got but one." For the natural scientists on board, Phipps and Irving, the walrus that got away is a side note in a larger grand narrative of Arctic conquest. Together with the polar bear, the common whale, the finfish, and many, many others, the walrus appears in Phipps's appendix in his official narrative of the trip under the category Mammalia, and I'm not going to read this here, but you can have a look at it. So the wounded walrus that escaped beneath the waves is here in this appendix, fixed in stasis. It's numbered, named, and neutered, forever part of Phipps's colonial archive, characterized by, to quote Lisa Lowe, quote, the tireless collection of tables, statistics, measurements, and numbers, unquote. In contrast, Equiano seems vexed and appreciative simultaneously by the walrus's collective defense against the whalers. He says, we never got but one, and he repeats this. So the walrus here in Equiano resists capture, escapes into the waves, and does not remain fixed by the text. This is an instance, I think, of how the text enunciates the exuberance and vitality of Arctic animals. They live and die. They flee and they are caught. They are cooked and ingested. They flock together and attack. They suffer and they survive. Their very materiality matters to the sailors and the seamen, and they matter to Equiano as a black sailor who himself has suffered and survived. In contrast, Phipps and others viewed them primarily as resources, if not for extracting sustenance, then for extracting knowledge and asserting control. That the walrus managed to defeat the sailors who had shot at it not alone, but in community, the whole herd joining forces, also lets us think about collective relations and the commons of the sea beyond the individualized liberal subject, which Equiano, in a way, needs to perform to be admitted into the realm of humanity as defined by Western modernity. But here, other, more sociable ways of being and relating emerge, asking, in the words of Joshua Bennett, that we reckon with the possibility of becoming multiple, that we might better understand how the enslaved survived the hold, what they transformed it into, and what such transformation means for how we imagine sociality as such. Such an analytic might help us to understand Equiano's narrative as a collective remembrance of enslavement. The more than human community of the walruses opens up a space to think Equiano beyond the individualistic and one-directional rhetorical I and into a realm of communality and polyphony. To summarize. So while Equiano is partially, contingently complicit in the colonial Arctic project, his presence as a black sailor and attendant also poses an uncomfortable interruption in the ship logs. And this is kind of the disruption that Katey and Alex were talking about earlier. His way of relating to both the saltwater purifying apparatus on the ship and the marine animals in the waves in an effective, embodied, and affiliative manner allows for an extended understanding of a more than human dimension that goes beyond colonial taxonomies and morphologies. In contrast to the scientific registers compiled by Irving and Phipps, Equiano's Black Arctic provides a counterpoint to the colonial perspective and perhaps suggests a more interconnected and reciprocal relationship with the natural world. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Katey. Julian, you're up next.
Yeah. So I'll speak for about 10 minutes. In many ways, I sort of still see myself very much as an outsider in relationship to Equiano's work because of how much my introduction to the Black Atlantic comes through the context of Atabok-Hugaano. And so I feel like a lot of my own education in thinking about the Black Atlantic has to do with how do I sort of begin to differentiate what are the unique things that each one of the Black Atlantic writers are doing. And when I think about Olade Equiano, I sort of think about him both in terms of what is he challenging the Romantic discourse to do in the way that it has sort of historically thought about these questions of environment and ecology and nature. And then at the same time, how is he kind of adding to the discourse in a way that we don't necessarily get with the more canonical Romantics? And so one of the things that I think is interesting about Jenny's sort of focus on the Arctic is that in many ways I was thinking about Equiano in terms of how he describes the concept of temperature and heat on the slave ship, and sort of trying to dichotomize the kind of climate that he's experiencing from the natural world that is now combined with this almost microclimate that is being created on the slave ship as a result of all of the slaves who are, being forcibly put together. And so, I think it is interesting that for someone like Equiano, his conception of climate is very much sort of premised upon the idea that it's constantly shifting, right? That if the whole notion of a slave ship is that it is something that is constantly in motion, then the degree to which the Black body is being exposed to these radically different climates at a moment's notice, I think, is something that in many ways separates Equiano in the way that he conceives of it. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of how he might differentiate himself from Mary Prince, who also talks about her own relationship to different climatological environments, depending upon which part of the world she happens to be in. So as a form of travel literature, Equiano chronicles his time in captivity aboard slave ships, giving readers a firsthand account of the transatlantic slave trade. And in addition to serving as a spiritual narrative, abolitionist text, and personal memoir, the interesting narrative also functions as a meditation on climate and weather, examining how the open sea affects the Black body. And in particular, I'm thinking about how Equiano documents an experience of dehydration, climate variance, temperature fluctuation, and bodily exhaustion to develop a broader commentary on the way weather informs the diasporic narrative. And so I'm thinking about this in terms of how is it possible that Equiano is essentially suggesting that the only way to really conduct a sort of full and comprehensive critique of racial capitalism is to also engage in the climatological politics that make this version of racial capitalism possible to begin with. So I'm thinking about what is the relationship between how he critiques racial capitalism that relies upon a climatological lexicon of sea-based weather. And so one passage that I'm thinking of in particular that I'd like to read aloud here is the way in which he actually conceives of skin complexion in relationship to climate. And this comes at the very end of the first chapter. And he says, "As to the difference of color between the Eboan Africans and the modern Jews, I shall not presume to account for it. It is a subject which has engaged the pens of men in both genius and learning, and is far above my strength. The most able and reverend Mr. T. Clarkson, however, in his much admired essay on the slavery and commerce of the human species, has ascertained the cause in a manner that at once solves every objection on that account, and on my mind at least has produced the fullest conviction. I shall therefore refer to that performance for the theory, contenting myself with extracting a fact as related by Dr. Mitchell. The Spaniards who have inhabited America under the torrid zone for any time are become as dark-colored as our native Indians of Virginia, of which I myself have been a witness. There is also another instance of a Portuguese settlement at Matomba, a river in Sierra Leone, where the inhabitants are bred from a mixture of the first Portuguese discoverers with the natives and are now become in their complexion and in the woolly quality of their hair, perfect Negroes, retaining, however, a smattering of the Portuguese language. These instances and a great many more which might be adduced, while they shew how the complexions of the same persons vary in different climates, it is hoped may tend also to remove the prejudice that some conceive against the natives of Africa on account of their color. Surely the minds of the Spaniards did not change with their complexions. Are there not causes enough to which the apparent inferiority of an African may be ascribed without limiting the goodness of God and supposing he forbear to stamp understanding on certainly his own image, because carved in ebony?" And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is it really does remind me of Atubakugano, because Atubakugano also thinks a lot about this idea of skin complexion. But what I sort of understand Equiano saying here is that you kind of lose the capacity to develop an argument about racial inferiority if you accept the premise that all human beings are in one way or another climatological entities, and that we are sort of all subject to the variances of the climate. So you can't really then make the argument that there's anything unique about the way in which we can ascribe inferiority to the African race if we accept first the premise that everybody is essentially functioning in relationship to the climate in some capacity. And so I find this to be particularly interesting because what I see this as is Equiano is grappling with the language of freedom through weather-based discourse, and that he's thinking about the Black body as one possible signifier of climatological relationships, but that in many ways we are all negotiating these issues of climate, regardless of what our racial background happens to be. And so, to me, this is the point where the abolitionist autobiography and personal memoir genres of the text suddenly become eco-critical in scope, as the work grapples with the rhetoric of freedom through weather-based observation, stipulating the Black body as one part of a broader set of climatological relationships. And so this conversation about climate then becomes connected with this notion of shifting location as we move into the conversation about the slave ship that he actually brings in chapter 2. And he's talking here about the role of heat and how it sort of plays a dual effect in terms of the climate that he's experiencing above on the kind of the deck of the ship, and then what's actually happening below. So this is interesting for me because one of the things that I often think about in relationship to Mary Prince when I'm thinking about the climate is that she's documenting the climate in terms of natural disasters, temperature fluctuations, and the bodily traumas that have been inflicted on her as a result of these different radical climates that she is being forced to endure. However, what distinguishes Equiano from someone like Prince is his central emphasis on oceanic climates and experiencing weather phenomena on the sea. And so the slave ship becomes this primary artifact and symbol in how we understand the way in which the climate functions in different ways. And so this next segment that I have here is from chapter 2, in which he talks about his early experience on the slave ship and the way in which he's understanding the presence of heat in different capacities. And so he writes, several of the strangers also shook hands with us Black people and made motions with their hands, signifying, I suppose, we were to go to their country, but we did not understand them. At last, when the ship we were in had got in all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put under deck, so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo was confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. So I find this to be particularly compelling because one of the things that Equiano is doing here is he is connecting these concepts of heat with the quality of the air, right? And the way in which it differentiates itself based on which part of the slave ship that you actually happen to be in. And so when he's talking, when he uses these terms such as the stench of the hold and the closeness of the place, he's obviously talking about the claustrophobia that is associated with being in these close quarters. But then we have the additional climatological component of how the sort of the mass of these bodies together are producing heat in such a way that simply exacerbates the climatological issues that are coming because of the heat of the sun, or, you know, the specific season in which they happen to be on the sea. So this to me signals the way in which Equiano is kind of constructing an imagery of a microclimate that exists within the slave ship itself that he must contend with, and how the kind of gasping for the fresh air on the deck is being directly juxtaposed against the contaminated air that we see manifesting itself within the holds of the ship. And so the suffocation that ensues is thus a reflection not only of limited spaces, but also of an excessively hot climate that accelerates perspiration, inevitably leading to dehydration. So we have this really interesting contrast between the kind of absence of water because of dehydration that's being expressed through the body, but the fact that they are literally surrounded by water, right, because of the slave ship being on the sea. The concept of heat, which is described here through its natural and physiological creation, becomes a way for Equiano to interrogate the inhumanity associated with being restricted in an unsanitary environment. Moreover, his characterization of heat as corrosive to the skin is what enables him to describe how excessive temperature shapes one's experience of climate on slave ships. Equiano even explains that staying on deck is preferable because of the access to fresh air, by which he means that the crowded holds result in two different climatic experiences, one on deck and one below, the latter of which breeds, quote, sickness among the slaves, end quote, who must inhale the deadly air. And I just think that this is really fascinating from the perspective of the broader conversation within British Romanticism, because this is such a different characterization of how to think of air in relationship to the way in which Romantic poets like Shelley and Wordsworth were thinking about air as this kind of extraordinarily liberating, phenomenon, where he's thinking about it as this incredibly suffocating extreme. And so these are sort of the ways in which I think of Equiano kind of placing himself within a broader conversation about climatology that in many ways sort of presents a completely new perspective that we don't get from the canonical romantics, but that also presents a new way of thinking about it that kind of pushes the discourse even further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Sorry. Thank you, Alex, Katey, Jenny, and Julian. I think this is amazing. And this is such a kind of fruitful and enriching opening of discussion. So many overlaps, and I think it's really great that you all were together at the same time. So I wonder if we have space, or do any of you have anything that you wanted to add or respond to? A lot of the themes emerging out of these four fairly brief discussions. Anything about the ship itself, about language, about ecologies and its various connections. So I'm going to open up I'm going to open up for like maybe a few minutes. If there's anything anybody wanted to jump in or respond to, I feel like we need to give space for that.
Yeah, perhaps I can jump in. I mean, I think I was, and this is something that I think between some of the work that Katey and I have done separately and are trying to do together, the question about ecological labor, right? And how we might locate a range of geographies and geographic epistemologies within the space of ecological labor. But then also what that says about the constitution of scientific knowledge, for example, so that if we use the context of Jamaica, if we use the context of someone like Robert Wedderburn or Equiano, right, we can notice the ways in which the development of what becomes represented as a apolitical knowledge, scientific objective knowledge, is always imbricated with the performance of ecological labor at these crucial moments, right? So that the ship, much like the plot or the plantation, becomes the site of these racial encounters, as McKittrick suggests, and these racial encounters sort of effectuate these kinds of worlds, right? And so I'm thinking about, Equiano involved with this distillation device, right? And in the case of Jamaica, in the case of so much of the Caribbean, you have other folks who are involved in, testing various kinds of scientific devices, right? And I think, in Wedderburn's longer work, he talks about, what it might mean then to return to these sites to understand how the ideas about knowledge is itself sort of wrapped up in these politics that are really crucial to then the politics of futurity, right? And so what might it mean to have a conversation about the sort of imperial ecologies of climate change that begin not with, say, a reference to the hockey curve, right, but with Equiano's venture to the Arctic, right? And what might a conversation about the sort of relationships of animality, right, that emerge at these intersections of scientific exploration, racialized subjugation, and violence, with, say, Equiano again in his position. What are those politics of animality that also need to be taken into a conversation about climate change and sort of environmental governance, which notice, right, the parallels between racialized subjectivity and exploration.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, in part because I feel like one of the things that Equiano is doing, along with someone like Mary Prince, is trying to construct a framework for how to understand the particular relationality that occurs between the Black body and climate, that there's almost a kind of epistemological knowledge production that's going on here in terms of trying to educate their readers in thinking this way. And I say this because, one of the things that I always find kind of unusual about reading and teaching Mary Prince's narrative is that when she talks so much about the rheumatism that she experiences and how the rheumatism she experiences, it flares up in certain cases depending upon the climatological environment that she is inhabiting. But there's still a bit of ambiguity there about whether what she is describing as rheumatism is a much more serious medical condition, or whether this is something that is being exacerbated purely because of the fact that she is being, shuffled to these radically different parts of the world. And then, of course, you have the intensive, labor that's being done, right? As you sort of reference the ecological labor that's being done. And I do think that there's something of value here in the way in which the Black body gets constructed, both as sort of a context of ecological labor, and then also an entity that is constantly being subjected to climate in these different capacities. And when you have that, right, what then becomes the end result when you sort of consider what it actually means to expose a body to this in this way? And it's something that I think about a lot when I'm trying to understand how Equiano and Prince almost seem to be in conversation with each other about these issues, about the climatological Black body.
And I'll say something real quickly before, and I'm sure Katey and Jenny would like to say, but also a conversation about affective atmospheres, right? And so to think about the scene that Katey provides at the beginning of dancing in the space of, the market. And so to think about the sort of the climate within which life is being lived, right? And how something like a hurricane, for example, which affects harvest, affects productivity, then comes to structure a microclimate, which is an affective climate that governs a whole host of relationships of kinship and the sort of perception of the self, right? And how the sort of concrete geographies, right, the material geographies of slavery, of forced labor, and so on, become perceptible or less perceptible because of various kinds of affective relations, right? Affective atmospheres. So I think that that's another really interesting way to think through, you know, the various things that we've been saying, and the sort of way that Black ecologies, Black geographies allows us to think about that.
Yeah, and it makes me think all of the papers, Jenny and Julian, I loved your papers. This, you know, there's been a lot of emphasis on Equiano's cosmopolitanism, right? His inclination to rove for good reasons. But it doesn't, I think all of our papers show that it doesn't mean he was disconnected from place, right? That he wasn't, and he didn't recognize other people's, as Alex was saying, like affective relationships to place. And Julian and Jenny, something that struck me about both your papers, as I've been thinking about it, is just how much Equiano experienced a racially differentiated climate, you know, whether it's in the hold of the ship compared to, you know, the sailors and enslavers who are able to get fresh air, or whether it's in the Arctic where he's like boiling water in this dangerous situation, you know, obviously must have been hot as well in a cold climate, right? So these that he's in these like racially differentiated climates.
Yeah, for sure. Something that, Katey, that you just said kind of brings together some of the thoughts that were swimming around in my head just now during the discussion, to regard Black geography and Black ecology as narrated, as mediated, as offered by Equiano or by Mary Prince or by whatever, and as relational and connective. Because I was thinking back to this idea of Black geography or Black ecology as offering a rupture, but also in a way maybe the potential for repair, the potential for going another way, or pursuing a different path of relating to the world, of thinking about the world. And with Equiano and the Arctic, for me, this connectivity really just came to mind when Julian was talking about the ship and the hold at the beginning and the kind of deathly climate, right? I'm thinking, of course, also of Christina Sharp here. But what he says about the Arctic climate is interesting, and it might help us think about Black ecology as connectivity even further, or maybe push us even further, because he says, so this is at the end when they return. The ships were caught in ice. They couldn't like move an inch forward or backwards, and then finally, thankfully, everyone was glad they were able to return to London. He says, on the 19th of August, we sailed from this uninhabited extremity of the world, where the inhospitable climate affords neither food nor shelter, and not a tree or shrub of any kind grows amongst its barren rocks, but all it is one desolate and expanded waste of ice, which even the constant beams of the sun for 6 months in the year cannot penetrate or dissolve. Right. So again, we have the inhospitable climate, and I mean, there's been incredible work done on this idea of uninhabitable or inhospitable places for certain people, but here, if we push a little bit and pursue this connective Black ecology, we can also recognize even other connections, because the Arctic wasn't uninhabited, right? So what if we follow Equiano, and what if you follow these relations? Then we can also go from a Black Arctic to an indigenous Arctic, and we can recognize these interconnections, but we can only do that because of Equiano's own experiences within, kind of placed at the heart, at the center, at the bottom of the ship, right? Enabling the survival of the expedition in a way by purifying the water, but then because of his own experiences and his own perspectives and his own kind of embodied and affective relation to the world, we can also think about other ecological relations, and I think that's exactly what or kind of this rupture that is offered in a way by Black geography and Black ecology.
And that raises a really interesting sort of question too about archives, right? Whether, whether ice cores in the Arctic are where we would expect to have an archive of sort of Black and Indigenous dispossession, forced labor, and so on. But it is, right? And so to think about the sort of racial ecologies that are constituted in this moment, right? Because of the kinds of fascination with an environmental determinism, right? What becomes written into the archives as something adjacent to the constitution of the scientific knowledge, which then might offer us new usable archives for thinking through the way race, power, and so on were constituted, right? And I think Julian pointed out to Equiano's references to pestilential conditions, right? And it is that kind of interest with conquering pestilential and miasmatic conditions that leads to the sort of ecological transformations in Latin America and the Caribbean, right, in the form of forest clearance. And at the time that is taking place, other people, kind of like Equiano, are also speculating about whether, whether climates shift across the world as you move, but also whether climates change on a local scale if you cut down the trees, right? And so in these moments where the preoccupation is on climate, right, and on perhaps Sylvia Winter might say, perhaps finding arguments to justify a bioevolutionary sort of rationalization for race and racism, you actually get the constitution of a sort of political ecology that is intended to prop up where there are questions, right? Because we don't know if clearing the trees will create this. We don't know if Equiano, I don't know if what I'm experiencing as the ship moves across is something that might be mapped in a way within sort of emerging scientific knowledge, but there's a question. And so to fill in those questions, then the sort of political ecology, racial ecology becomes constituted, right, and is then presented. But Equiano in the process is showing us that that constitution is, there was not an inevitability between the observation and the explanations.
Jenny, did you want to?
If we have time.
Sure, of course.
Just very briefly, because I love, Alex, what you just said about the archive, because that's something that I've been thinking about so much, and that's kind of what I want to do when in the presentation, I gave also examples from kind of the official expedition report, right, by Konstantin Phipps, which includes this appendix and this report by Irving that's included in the narrative by Phipps. So it's this that is the colonial archive. That is the kind of the epitome of the ship log, of note taking, of numbering, taxonomizing. And then we have Equiano, whose narrative is published a couple of years later, 5 years after Phipps's report. And Equiano takes a lot from Phipps. He copies a lot, he takes a lot, but it's not that simple. And if you cross-read or cross-reference or cross-annotate in Sharp's words, then you suddenly realize the other kinds of archival practices that are also at work. And what I'm trying to think about right now for the book is thinking about vibrant archives. What are these other archives that are there? Ecological archives, archives of environmental degradation, destruction, but also relation. And I think with Equiano, but also Prince, and also someone like Mary Seacole a bit later in the 19th century, there's so much about ecological relation there, and specifically Black and Caribbean and Black Atlantic ecologies that kind of brush against, tangle with, go beyond but are also sometimes complicit with the colonial archive. And it's not like an easy, it's not an easy opposition or binary. It's so, yeah, it's entangled. And I think with Equiano, we see that so much with the way he takes part in these expeditions, but the way he also appropriates this kind of white European scientific object for his own use. I mean, there's a scene earlier in the book where he learns to read the sea by using the quadrant. He's being taught by a sailor and then also by a captain, even though the crew didn't agree with that, because no black man should be allowed to be able to read the ocean. But that's exactly what Equiano learns, and how he then is able to move across, to come back to the cosmopolitan aspect that Katey mentioned. So yeah, I don't know. I think I wanted to go somewhere, but this is where I ended up, so I'm going to stop now here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great place for us to stop. And I'm really appreciating all the spaces that you all have created for it to invite us to think about other texts. I know all the names mentioned, thinking what Julian said about Mary Prince and my own work on the paratextual things about that are we are invited to read between what happens in Mary Prince's text and Equiano's as well. And Katey and Alex, we can't wait for the Wedderburn work to come out, and hopefully they'll be soon. Okay, well, and thank you. Thanks once again, one more time, to Julian Whitney, Jenny Leetsch, Alex Moulton, and Katey Castellano. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Great to meet you all, or see you.
You too.